Now, one day, Mr. Schwartz went to meet, no relation to anyone here, by the way. One day, Mr. Schwartz went to meet his new son-in-law to be, Saul. And he says to Saul, who is a very religious young man, "So, nu, tell me, Saul, what do you do?" "I study Torah," he replies. "But Saul, you are going to marry my daughter. If you are going to study Torah all the day long, how are you going to feed her? How are you going to provide for her?" "No problem," says Saul. "I study Torah, and it says God will provide. But you will have children. How will you educate them?" he says. "No problem," says Saul. "I study Torah, and it says God will provide." Mr. Schwartz goes home, and his wife, who's been waiting this whole time, anxiously asks what Saul is like. "Well," says Mr. Schwartz, "he's a lovely boy. I only just met him, and already he thinks I'm God." The benefit of the doubt is as ancient a Jewish value as the Torah itself. In fact, we'll read about it this afternoon as we study from the Holiness Code, Leviticus. It's found in verse 15. It says, "In righteousness shall you judge your neighbor." Now, at first glance, this does not seem to imply extending the benefit of the doubt, as Mr. Schwartz did to his soon son-in-law Saul. But in truth, it is telling us that before we pass judgment, we must take into consideration all of the possibilities that may lead to an individual to act as they do. It's a little like that ethical quandary. Yes, he stole medication, but if he hadn't, his child might die. In Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, our sages entitled this concept of the benefit of the doubt, Dan lekaf zachut. Judge everyone on the positive side of the scale. Or in other words, consider each other blameless until it is proven otherwise. And actually, it's even really more than this. For it instructs us that if we have a choice to assign either a good or a bad motive to another person's actions, then we must deliberately err on the side of the good. Once a burly, gruff-looking man who had served in the Russian army entered a Jewish inn, and he ordered a meal. Now, when Jewish boys were drafted in the Russian army, it usually was the end of Judaism for them. They were conscripted, and the army brainwashed them to worship Mother Russia rather than God. Well, he plopped himself down, and he ate in a most disgusting manner, stuffing an entire chicken in his mouth. It was truly revolting that this man, a Jew, could conduct himself in such a repulsive way, not to mention the fact that he never said a bracha and he didn't even wear a kippah. The innkeeper and the others present were sickened. They were embarrassed by his display, though none dared to say anything. The Chafetz Chaim, a great rabbi, happened to be a guest at that inn. He saw the young man, and slowly he approached him. Everyone wondered what he could possibly say to the man. What could he say? Surely this oaf would not listen to any rebuke, even from such a holy man. The Chafetz Chaim asked the man, "Is it true that you served in the Russian army?" "Yes," snorted the man, bracing his defenses for the oncoming tongue lashing he was fully expecting. "Well, tell me," began the Chafetz Chaim, "how did you manage to keep your Jewish identity in those circumstances? So many Jewish boys entered the army only to eventually give up their Judaism. They are forced to serve for 25 years, no kosher food, no Jewish holidays, no other vestige of Judaism, yet when you could have easily gone to any other inn, you chose a Jewish one. You still identify as a Jew. I don't know if I could have done what you did. You, he said, are an inspiration. Where did you find the strength? Well, the soldier, caught off guard and clearly moved, looked straight at the Chafetz Chaim. It was so hard they did everything to pound it out of us, to make us denounce and forget we were Jews. It is a miracle you made it through. Now you can begin to learn Torah, mitzvot, that you were deprived of all these years. But Rebbe, how can I possibly do that? The soldier responded through sobs. I want to return to my heritage, but I am so far removed. Surely it is impossible for someone like me to learn. No, said the rabbi. It is still possible. It's always possible. And I can show you how. And as the soldier spoke to the rabbi, the stones on his heart began to melt. Had the Chafetz Chaim not avoided a rush to judgment, like the other people in the inn, had he not assumed the good, this transformative moment would never have happened. Now, of course, the Chafetz Chaim was one who devoted himself to fulfilling the midah of dan lakuf zachut, lakaf zachut. For the rest of us, it's a bit more of a struggle not to let our baser instincts take hold. There seems to be some innate need within us to make sense of the way that people act around us, and much too often, we are ready to assume the worst. Mr. and Mrs. Greenberg once went out to see My Fair Lady on stage, and at that time, it was the most sold-out show on Broadway. But somehow, they managed to score a matinee show with 2 front-row seats. As they settled in, they noticed that in the row behind them, there was a seat left open. So when intermission came and no one had yet arrived to sit in that seat, Mrs. Greenberg turned to the woman sitting next to it and asked, "Pardon me, but it's so hard to get a ticket to the show. We were wondering why the seat is empty." The woman replied, "That's my late husband's seat." Mrs. Greenberg was horrified and apologized for being so insensitive. But a few minutes later, she just could not help herself and turned around again. Without meaning to be rude or anything, but again, this being such an incredibly hard show to get into, surely you must have a friend or a relative who wanted to come and see the show. Well, the woman nodded her agreement and then explained, "They're all at the funeral." Well, we laugh because the widow is in stark contrast to what we might expect. And the apparent tragedy of the moment elicits laughter to quell our disbelief. We laugh because we've run up against people whose sense of priorities may be much the same. And to be fair, up front, the widow does seem rather cold-hearted. But perhaps her husband was a lover of the stage. Perhaps they had spent a lifetime attending shows. Perhaps he had tried tirelessly to obtain the tickets that she now is using. Perhaps he had been terminally ill, and it was his dying wish that they see this last show together. Perhaps this was the most loving tribute she could offer to her husband. Perhaps. Yet more often than not, we're prone to feel there cannot possibly be any excuse or justification for the behaviors that we encounter other than what they appear on the surface. And usually we're not all that open for looking for one. In my experience, however, there is always, almost always something else going on. Nevertheless, would the first woman have considered other possibilities? Would we, did we consider other possibilities? My sense of the world tells me that no one develops in a vacuum. We are, each of us, the products of our biology as well as our environment. Both profoundly affect the way that we interact with our world. But how many of us are willing to stop first before reacting, hold our judgment, and consider what may have brought anyone else to that particular moment at hand? Well, until I've lived the life of someone else, which is impossible for me to do, it is mine only to try and understand, not to judge. Understanding is the first step toward empathy. Empathy is the first step toward loving, and loving is the highest goal in all of the Torah. Judgment, on the other hand, is the first step toward isolation. Isolation is the first step toward a community's ethical collapse. And the ethical collapse of community is exactly what the Torah warns us against more than anything else. So let me ask, when children act exactly how children are meant to behave, how often do we judge their parents? When someone dresses in ways we wouldn't dress ourselves, how often do we judge their character? Think now. When one inadvertently shows himself to be less than perfect, how often do we rush to criticize? When someone offers a remark that startles us, how often do we dismiss their intelligence? When someone takes a political stand opposite of our own, how quick are we to question their patriotism? When our colleague fails at a task, how rapidly do we declare their incompetence? When our partner cannot divine our thoughts, how often do we assume they're non-caring? When our children fail an exam, how ready are we to accuse them of goofing off? We are very quick to make snap judgments, and yet we are committed, dan lakaf zachut, judge everyone on the positive side of the scale. There's probably something else going on that we should be considering. Let me share a story I learned of only just the other day. I was talking with Pat, our facilities manager, and he was sharing with me how this past Sunday there had been what appeared to be a homeless man sitting outside the church that he attends. Pat was only carrying a small amount of cash, but what he had he gave to the man. And later, after services, he was discussing the gentleman with his priest. The priest acknowledged that he too had given the man script for groceries at the local stores. As it turns out, both the priest and the man were at the same store later on that day. And the priest witnessed the man giving away most of his script. When asked why he had just given it away, the man humbly replied, because they needed it more. Imagine that man sitting outside of our shul on Rosh Hashanah, perhaps today. As we come to services dressed in our holiday clothes, we see him on the bench in faded clothes, worn out shoes, perhaps in need of a shave, perhaps a Jew, perhaps not. And what goes through our minds? What judgments do we make? How much dan lakaf zachut are we prepared to engage in? And as a result, how do we respond? Because that's truly the crux of the matter. Without erring on the positive side of the scale, we miss so many opportunities to grow as individuals and to help repair our world. Without stopping to look and to listen and to consider, our judgment of others erects walls that isolate us from real human need. Our ability to respond as God would have us respond is dramatically curtailed. We might never learn the lesson of that man's example. Instead of spreading the goodness of his humble act, sharing even that which he has so little of, we might instead spread words of contempt, dividing us yet further from the other, one who in reality is our neighbor. It's not that others cannot sometimes be wrong. It's not that others cannot sometimes do wrong. But snap judgments get us nowhere. And they do not fall under the heading of Dan Lakaf Zachut. Leo Biscaglia would tell a story of how he had once entered a department store and was standing in line. The line was moving slowly as it was after the holidays, and people were bringing back goods to return. Some only wanting to exchange their items for different sizes, some wanting to complain about the quality of what they had purchased. The clerk at the counter was less than pleasant. As much as people seemed to be showing her attitude, she was showing it right back. It was tense, it was uncomfortable, it was combative. And when it was his turn, he laid his items on the counter. And the clerk shot him one of those defensive glances. I want to stop here. As Jon Stewart would say, meet me at camera 3. Come over here. And ask, in such a situation, how would we respond? We've all been there. We've been in line. We've had clerks up ahead of us. We've had clerks as nasty as all get out. Would we judge that clerk to be rude and unaccommodating? I bet we would. Based on our judgment, would we be ready for battle? Would we have been rehearsing our retorts while waiting in line? Would we have already prepared a statement of condemnation to share with the clerk upon checking out? Something to the effect of, I thought the customer always comes first. Something snarky, something meant to show just how much she was failing to meet our expectations. Well, it wasn't the route that Leo took. Instead, he began by compassionately observing. You're really having a really rough day, aren't you? And you know, that was all it took. He had made no judgments. He assumed the benefit of the doubt. He assumed this was a good person, a person who loved her family, a person who normally went out of her way to help others, a person who at any other time, in any other circumstance, would be a delight to go have a cup of coffee with. That's what he afforded her. And that, whether it was true or not, is what allowed him to offer her an act of compassion. Yes, she admitted, so overwhelmed with gratitude that someone was willing to see her and not a clerk. I am. Leo offered some encouraging words. He complimented her, thanked her when she was through. The rest of her day was a breeze. It was a day she always remembered. And no matter how disgruntled a customer might have been, that day, at least, they each received a smile. Dan lakaf zachut. Judge everyone on the positive side of the scale. It's a midah. It's a measure of response. One of many, by the way, which lead to an active and purposeful Jewish life. It breaks down the expectations that we assign to roles and allows us to see people for who they truly are. It allows us to commune with the human story, which in essence is the story that we call our own. For somewhere at our core, we are truly all much more similar than we are different, which is why we are so emphatically instructed to love each other as ourselves. As we want to be seen, let us see the one across from us. Let me share with you one more reading. It's a piece that comes from the heart. It's a plea that prompts us all to see deeper than the surface and to respond to what we find there. It was written by an elderly woman, now alone in her years. She addresses her nurse, but in truth, her words address each of us. What do you see, nurse? What do you see? Are you thinking when you are looking at me a crabby old woman, not very wise, uncertain of habit with far-away eyes? I'll tell you who I am, nurse, as I sit here so still, as I do your bidding, as I eat at your will. I'm a small child of 10, a young girl of 16, a bride soon at 20, my heart leaping. At 25 now, I have young of my own. At 40, my young sons, well, they've grown and gone, but my man's beside me to see I don't mourn. Dark days are upon me. My husband is dead. I look to the future, I shudder with dread. I'm an old woman now, and nature is cruel. 'Tis her jest to make old age look like a fool. But inside this old carcass, a young girl still dwells. And now and again, my battered heart, it swells. I think of the years gone by too fast, and I know that nothing can last. So open your eyes, nurse. Open and see. Let us try this year to open our eyes. Let us try this year to hear more and judge less. Let us try this year to sanctify our lives as a gift for potential and good. Let us try this year to assume the best and forget all the rest. Shana Tova.